Now, there are critics who make the attempt, critics who try to say the Quran contains inconsistencies. A publication that came to my attention recently suggested that the Quran was contradictory on the subject of marriage, because in one place it says, don't marry more than one wife unless you can provide for them all, and in another place it said, don't marry more than four. Now, this they see as a contradiction. What they have is a contradistinction. In the one case, the qualification for marrying more than one has been given. In the other case, limitation on how many that may be married is given. There is no contradiction. Critics are too quick to grab hold of something and give it an interpretation and offer it as an excuse to escape the reality of this document. For critics who would attack the Quran and insist that it contains mistakes, we can use the same method as in our reply to Christians who claim that Jesus is on record as claiming to be equal to God. Remember the three categories of evidence offered. The evidence offered was either insufficient, ambiguous, or impossible. You see, if someone cites a verse from the Quran trying to show that it is a mistake, we only need to show that the verse cited is insufficient to establish that there is a mistake, or we need to show that the verse cited has other meanings than the one given by the critic, or we can demonstrate that the verse cited cannot possibly have the interpretation which the critic is giving it. It will always fall into one of these three categories. I had the experience on one occasion of describing some of the contents of the Quran to a man who didn't know what the book was I was talking about. It sat next to me with the cover turned over. I just told him about the book, what it contained, told him it was not the Bible. His conclusion was that the book was miraculous. This man was a minister in a Christian church. He said, yes, that book could not possibly have originated with a man. Therefore, it must have come from the devil, because it is not the Bible. Well, the Quran comments on this suggestion, the 26th surah, 211th ayah, as to those who would suggest that the book came from the devil. It points out that it doesn't quite suit him, does it? Is this how the devil misleads people? He tells them, worship none but God. He insists that they fast, that they practice charity. Is this how the devil misleads people? Compare the attitude of someone like this to the attitude of the Jews who knew Jesus and opposed him until the very end. There is an episode reported in the Bible where Jesus raised a man from the dead, one Lazarus, who had been dead for 4 days. When Lazarus came out of the tomb alive again, those Jews who were watching, what did they do? Did they suddenly say, this man is a true prophet, and become believers? No, the Bible says they immediately discussed among themselves that since this man is working all these signs, soon everyone will believe in him. We've got to find a way to kill him. And they attributed his miraculous powers to the devil. He raised that man by the power of the devil. Now the Christian reads that episode and feels very sorry for those Jews who had clear evidence right before their very eyes and attributed the miracles, the signs, to the devil. Doesn't it appear that they may be doing the same thing when we illustrate what we have in the Quran and their final excuse is only it originated with the devil? There are those who will insist that the Quran was copied, that it originated in Christian and Jewish sources. As a matter of fact, a book published in recent years called Worshipping the Wrong God has stated, as though it were a fact, that after the first revelation of the Quran came to Muhammad, alayhi salam, that his wife died. And so he quickly married a Jew and a Christian. And this is where he drew the rest of his sources for his book. Well, they have the facts partly right. It was 10 years after the first revelation of the Quran that his wife died. And it was another 10 years after that, when the Quran was virtually complete, that he married a Jew and a Christian. Did he copy from Jewish and Christian sources? In the Quran, the ruler of Egypt who opposed Moses is known as Pharaoh, not Pharaoh. the Jews and Christians have always said Pharaoh. It's easy for an Arab to say Pharaoh, but in the Quran it's Firaun with an N. Why? Surely the Jews and Christians who surrounded the Muslim community must have teased them about that and said, you've got the word wrong. It's Pharaoh, not Firaun. But they insisted on it, and it continues that way in the Quran, Firaun. As it happens, the historical writings of Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, exist to this day, and Herodotus comments on the ruler of Egypt being, in his day and in the centuries before him, one man who went by the title of Firaun. Did the book copy from Christian sources, where in the 4th surah it insists that Jesus was not crucified, that this was only an illusion, or that the Jews who thought they crucified Jesus were mistaken because it wasn't really so? Christians would have no part of that. As it happens, the idea that Jesus was not really crucified is really very ancient and can be traced back to the 1st century. But Christians who believed that were eliminated as heretics within the first 200 years after the time of Jesus. And they weren't teaching this doctrine anywhere around the Arabian Peninsula 14 centuries ago. Could the author of the Quran have been copying from Christian sources when he says in the 3rd surah, the 46th ayah, speaking of Jesus, that he spoke to men as a babe and in later life? And the Arabic word used indicates that he still was speaking to men and teaching to them in his 40s. The Christians have always maintained that Jesus was gone by the time he was 33. It indicates there could have been no copying. In fact, a man would have to be stubborn and insist on the points as explained in the Quran, in the face of Christian opposition, who would have said, no, it wasn't like that. We tell the story differently. Now to the words of prophets themselves, another path that leads to Islam. In the Persian scriptures, which have been around for thousands of years, we find long before the time of Islam and its arrival in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Farsi scriptures, Dasatir number 14, we read, when the Persians should sink so low in morality, a man will be born in Arabia, whose followers will upset their throne, religion, and everything. The mighty, stiff-necked ones of Persia will be overpowered. The house which was built, and in which many idols have been placed, will be purged of idols, and people will say their prayers facing towards it. His followers will capture the towns of the Farsis, and Taus, and Balkh, and other big places round about. People will embroil with one another. The wise men of Persia and others will join his followers. Muslims recognize this very quickly because the Kaaba, the building which all Muslims face in prayer every day, was at one time filled with idols, and it was part of the mission of Muhammad alayhi salam to purge the house of idols. They were cleansed, and that house sits there empty still today. It was in the next generation after the time of the Prophet that the wise men of Persia and others did join his followers. In the Bible, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, we have the words of Moses, who reports that God told him that he would raise up a prophet from among the brothers of the Israelites like Moses. Now Christians wish to apply this to Jesus, to say he was the prophet like Moses. It's uncomfortable for them to recognize, however, that Jesus was not very much like Moses. Now, Jesus had no father, no wife, no children. He didn't die of old age, and he didn't lead a nation. All of these things Moses had or did. But they say, well, Jesus will return. He'll return as a victorious person, and so he'll be more like Moses. Do they really expect he will return to also acquire a father and a wife and children, and then die of old age? Not usually.